ripples faded and the broken images solidified. The first one took him by surprise. There in the black water was the image of a beautiful woman in her early 20s. Then he saw her curved ears and realized she was an elf. As rare as such a vision was, it was even more startling to see her completely nude, so far as he could tell, because only the top half of her body was visible. She was wet and being held very close to someone as a strong arm cradled her body. Aleph did not allow his interest in her beauty to creep into his mind until the image moved upward slightly, past the pointed ear, to reveal the owner of the arm around the naked woman. His own concerned face appeared over her wet hair before the image vanished into the black water. A second image formed, showing a battle between a wizard and the dragon that Aleph sought. The fancily dressed wizard put forth a vain effort to kill the dragon with a lightning bolt spell. An image of the wizard's horrified face appeared as the lightning bolt arced downward and away from the dragon. A sudden flash of fire covered the wizard, then ripples moved across the pond again. The water smoothed in the darkness and another vision came, showing a flight of arrows streaking through the moonlit woods to strike a rough-looking group of men standing around a campfire on the bank of a lake or other body of water. Another image rippled in as the last one faded. He saw a wooden sign hanging over a tavern with the words "The Flying Unicorn" carved into it. He knew that tavern from his travels. The pool smoothed to show one last vision, one he had barely enough time to react to. The new image was from ground level, looking upward into a tree. The dark form of a humanoid, gray-furred creature that was poised on a branch ready to pounce on its victim below. A split second before the creature leaped, Aleph realized he was not seeing a magical vision, but rather the reflection of something above him. He leaped backward onto the soft, swampy ground as the Lawluth landed where he had been, its hind claws sinking deeply into the soil. "The Lawluth?" Fristel asked in wonder. Darmir nodded. "They are now extinct, save for a few rare in the deepest of swamps." Seeing confusion on the faces of the others, he described the foul beast further. "The Lawluth is best described as an ape-like creature, slightly smaller than a man, covered with long, mangy gray fur. It has the claws and ferocity of a crazed wildcat, and teeth like those of a large wolf. They are voracious carnivores and find human flesh most appealing." "Are they not also known as swamp hags?" I asked. Darmir raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Aye, young sire," he smiled slightly, "that they are." The Lawluth, or swamp hag, stood in a stooped posture, its black lips curled back in a low growl. Aleph caught the creature's unclean stench and saw its coarse gray hair barely covering its putrid, corpse-gray skin. At the moment of life and death, he felt a quick thought pass through his mind. There was indeed something that stank worse than Vera. The swamp hag fit its name, he noted, seeing the outlines of flabby breasts under the mangy hair. The human-like mouth curled at the edge, showing yellow teeth, sharp and irregular. Its broad nose bordered two bloodshot yellow eyes. The beast could have easily killed him, or any unarmed man, but since he recovered from his surprise, it had no chance against the steel of his blade. His sword sang as it slid from its sheath, putting a fresh edge to the blade. In one deft stroke, the pouncing Lawluth lost its head and its life. As the corpse fell to the ground, quivering in its death throes, the hair shrank away into the body's wrinkled skin. Slowly, it turned into a naked, dirty woman. Aleph glanced at the severed head and saw that it, too, had changed into a human face, one that was vaguely familiar. It was Vera, naked and reverted from the creature into her dead human form. He then recalled hearing a priest tell him once that a Lawluth was not an actual creature, but a cursed human, with a disease similar to lycanthropy. He could only imagine that the swamp hag before him was the witch woman who had told him of Mirror Lake. Perhaps she sent travelers to their deaths in the deeper swamp when she could not kill them at her hovel. He felt only slight remorse upon seeing the dead wretch before him. Despite her reasons, she had been of true help. The images from the lake had no particular meaning yet, but he knew understanding them would come in time. For now, all he wanted was to leave this foul scene behind. Then the tales of a form of lycanthropy disease associated with the Lawlooth are true? Rickard asked. Darmir nodded to the young cleric, who was one of my close friends. Most people knew of only one disease, lycanthropy, wherein the cursed victim turns into a werewolf. Darmir had long since told us of many different forms of the disease, generally known as canthropy, in which the cursed victim transformed into other animals or creatures. Yes, lad, 'tis true. Not only can one be cursed with the disease by dark magic, but also from the attack of one of the creatures. That is one of the reasons that the foul creatures were hunted out of existence in many places. I shuddered at the thought of such a beast living in the nearby forest of Raylan, and was very glad they did not. As do I, young sire, Darmir told me. I looked at him in confusion. I had not voiced my thoughts, or had I? Darmir smiled secretly and began his tale again. Soon after the incident at the pool, Alef found the small town of Leaston and the Flying Unicorn Tavern. He still did not know what relationship the tavern had with his quest, nor did he understand the mystery of the elf woman. He remembered a flight of arrows and decided to work on that image first. Alef's assumption was that he was the one who shot the arrows in the vision. As such, he decided it was time to purchase a bow and a score of arrows, since he did not currently possess either. He went directly to the blacksmith, for, unlike larger shires where there were separate smithies, armories, and weaponers, in the smaller towns the blacksmiths made all the weapons. Although trained in the use of many hand weapons, only a few knights ever learned the use of crossbow or bows. Haughty knights saw such weapons as cowardly way to dispatch an enemy, having been raised to believe that the only honorable way to fight an enemy was through hand-to-hand combat. Alef once was such a knight, but he was a realist, and had not been so foolish as to scorn learning the bow. Many times during his knightly quests, a bow was the only way he secured meat. Like his other knightly skills, he knew his archery was out of practice, but he felt he could still string a bow and nock an arrow. While he chose the best longbow available from those present, the smith asked him if he wished to purchase any arrows, and of what type. Alef tried to remember the arrows he had seen in his vision, but could not recall them exactly. Seeing the deep furrowing of the man's brow, and misreading the expression, the smith asked, "What do ye intend to shoot? Mayhap I can recommend the type of arrow you may wish to use." At first, Alef's ego caused for him to bash the smith for daring to ask such a doltish question. Any knight would have been offended by the man's offer to help in choosing a weapon. Even the lowliest knight knew the proper weapon for every battle. However, during his years spent as a humble farmer, Alef's lofty arrogance from knighthood had been put to rest firmly. He scarcely noticed the smith's insolent query. He shrugged and said, "Dragon." The blacksmith turned pale. Alef realized he had been out of touch for at least 3 weeks, and based on the man's reaction, he missed a lot of news. Once the smith calmed, Alef told him how anxious he was for any news of the hellspawn that had ruined his life. The smith quickly told him of towns turned to ash, farmland burned, and of herds of cattle shredded and left to rot. Hundreds were homeless, dead, or wounded. "Aye, sire," the smith said. "Even the nearby castle of Duke Herod has been destroyed. I heard tell it was leveled to its foundations. 'Twere no survivors, and I remember one priest saying they found the remains of the Duke's charred body in the cellar with several others." Alef nodded at the long list of death and destruction, with only half his attention, because the news of Herod's fate caught his thoughts. He once visited the arrogant man and heard of nothing else but how he spent his wealth on fortifications. The curtain walls, over 12 feet thick, were reinforced in many places with iron. To rend such a castle would require immense power. As the smith's tale neared its end, he asked, "What type of arrows do you have that would be best for piercing a dragon's hide?" The smith smiled grimly and shook his head. "None that I have, my lord." Walking a short distance to the shafts he added, "The only non-magical arrows sharp enough to penetrate dragon scales I ever heard of were those made from the rare shurkite stone." Aleph frowned. He had seen the use of such arrows in battle once, and that memory forever burned in his mind what those arrows could do. He knew that is what he wanted, but he also knew that the green, marble-like stone was extremely rare in its raw state, and even rarer when made into tools or points. "Judging by your look, ye know of them," the smith added. Aleph nodded. "The only such arrows I've seen, let's see, I figure it were about 10 year ago. They belonged to some archer who passed by." "An archer? Must have been a fairly rich one to own arrows with shurkite points." "Aye, he was dressed well enough. I thought he were a dandy at first. He was heading for the headwaters of the Crystal River to seek a brother who'd been missing for some time." He frowned, shrugged, and spoke softly. "He never returned. If he found his brother or died, I nae know. Ye might go to the headwaters and find out. Of course, 'tis not much safer than looking down the dragon's mouth." "You mean the tales of the water freezing all those who touch it?" "Aye, that and where ye be having to go may well have a rock beast or two." "I'm not sure whether I believe the story of the water being that cold, but there's one way to find out. If it means I might find a way to kill that dragon, so be it." He drew the bowstring to test the bow's strength. "As for rock beasts, I've killed one or two in my time." Aleph paid the smith and thanked him, adding a score of hunting arrows to his quiver. As Aleph mounted his horse, the smith offered another piece of the puzzle that Aleph saw in Mirror Lake. "By the by, ye aren't the only one that's come looking for something to kill a dragon with." "Who else?" He did not know if he liked the idea of competition. "Didn't he catch her name? 'Twas an elf dressed like a ranger or scout. Fairly good-looking one, in fact. She passed by 3 days ago, and was just as interested about the archery as ye. She said she would search for the arrows, too. She left sooner than she wished, though." He felt a spark of interest. "Why so?" The blacksmith frowned and pointed at the tavern. "She went there to spend the night when one of the town scum tried to force herself on him. With her draw-stroke she gutted him like a fish where he stood." He smiled. "None in town would hold that again her. In fact, she did us a favor, but his 10 friends thought different. She rode out of town with them but a half-day's ride behind." Aleph felt concerned, though he privately admired the elf's skill. Few could kill an opponent with a draw-stroke. The fact of the event fired his temper. Which way did they go? He cast his hand westward, toward the great swamp. He looked up at Aleph in curiosity. "Ye going after her, then?" With a grim expression, he nodded. In his previous life, such an adventure was what he lived for. The elf probably did not need his help, nor would she accept it if offered. Nonetheless, the thought of such vile action against a woman burned his soul like a firebrand, brought a bitter taste to his mouth. It would not be the first time he defended a woman against such knaves. He looked down at the smith as a raging determination filled him. With a deep, resolute tone he said, "By my soul, I'll be damned if I let some human scum force themselves on a woman. Not as long as I draw a breath in this world or any other." The smith forced a slight, grim smile at the man's deathly serious tone. "Who are you, sire?" Aleph's expression did not change, though his eyes narrowed. As he kicked his mount forward, he said, "Someone who still has some honor." "Bah!" Darmir turned toward Hector. "What is it now, boy?" His patience was wearing thin. "The same thing happens in most of your tales. Some handsome prince or knight goes off to rescue a maiden in distress. 'Tis the nature of true love, boy. True, such actions speak not as loudly as they once did. But still, some have the spirit to ride into the darkest nights for their love. or they have the nobility to fight for those who are unable to fight for themselves, he sneered. That's what separates some of us from the lower animals. He looked at all of us. It is true that Aleph did not yet love this elf. Indeed, he had yet to meet her. But from his vision he knew she was part of his destiny, and such a vision must be sought no matter the risk. This is just a story, Hector said. Nothing like that ever really happens. Darmir leaned back in his chair and looked through Hector as if he did not exist. If you say, boy, he said absent-mindedly. Hector smiled, thinking he had finally said something right. Those of us more experienced in love and life, however, smiled because we knew the truth of Darmir's comment. Nudging her horse around yet another large cryptid tree, Maris found her thoughts drifting to the event at the tavern several days earlier. She had no regrets except for not killing the cretin more slowly so she could have spat on his face before he died. Still, the look of shock and surprise on his face when he realized what had happened made up for it. It was a shame he had been so drunk. He probably had not felt any pain. At least he would never try to force his attention on another woman, one who might not be able to defend herself. Disgust for the townspeople's lack of courage made her stomach sour again. He had been only one man against their 6. The natives could have easily stood up to him and run him out of town. At least they could have thrown him out in her defense. Even if he had 10 friends, those following her, none were there at the time. Instead of unifying, the townspeople let the ruffians have their way. She imagined they probably hoped some stranger would come to town with enough guts to stand up to the scum and do what was necessary. Such was not uncommon. Rather than stand up for themselves, people wanted others to do their dirty work for them, only to find themselves run out of town or dead the following day. She thought of the 10 men following her. It took them until mid-afternoon the previous day just to pick up her trail. Although she had not been trying to lose them after a day's ride through the dark, winding forest and humid swamp, she was sure she delayed them enough to ensure a peaceful night's sleep. She looked forward to their becoming hopelessly lost, or to dealing with them later as they wandered in the swampy mist, wondering where the attack might come from. The elf made camp near one of the many small lakes that bordered the great swamp. Few dared to do so, preferring to leave the swamp and travel as fast as possible to reach its outskirts. But then few would have entered the swamp at all for fear of the different creatures prowling it at night. Such creatures meant little to Marist. She knew what lived in this area of the swamp, how to avoid them, and how to deal with them. Building a small cook fire, she took her bow and walked along the edge of the water. Within a short time she shot 3 fish for her meal. After quickly gutting them and putting them on spits, she stretched out to relax after a day in the saddle. The smell of cooking fish filled the area, making her mouth water in anticipation. Maris did not worry about the scent carrying through the swamp. If the smell of cooking fish attracted any of the swamp predators, the firelight and smell of smoke would keep them away. Soon she was tossing cleanly picked bones into the fire, looking about her small encampment. Gazing upon the lake's moonlight water, she decided a swim was just what she needed before sleep. After carefully leaning her unsheathed sword against a large vinwood tree, she discreetly hid her bow under a nearby bush, sticking 5 arrows into the ground beside it, so they seemed part of the bush. Finally, she set 6 of her throwing daggers in staggered rows at the water's edge. Once satisfied that weapons were at hand, she disrobed, placing her clothing in her saddlebag. Caution she had learned since the time she lost her clothes to a small pack of chirpies, the semi-intelligent gliding squirrels about the size of a house cat. Chirpies were not mean-spirited and probably did not understand what they took, but they were well known for stealing camping supplies. She had spent most of that day naked, searching for her clothes among trees and bushes. Invigorated by the cool night air against her bare skin, she sighed quietly and slipped into the refreshing water. Unknown to her, 10 pairs of eyes lustily followed her movements from the dark wood. Their mouths watered with anticipation, though not due to the scent of cooked fish they detected before seeing the firelight. Maris swam to the center of the lake before hearing a rustle among the forest brambles. Treading water, she looked in the darkness, but even with her superb night vision, she saw nothing in the weak flickering firelight that stabbed into the wood. Thinking some night animal must have followed the scent of her cooked food and became curious, she ignored the sound. Moments passed before she decided it was best to head back to camp. The curious animal overcame its natural fear of fire, or it was a pack of chirpies roaming about. She slowly swam back, enjoying the cool flow of water over her naked body and the clear, star-studded night sky above, the quarter moon casting a pale blue glow over the land. There was little that she enjoyed more than a swim on such a night. She was only a few feet from the bank when a group of men suddenly appeared in line before her fire, making her stop and tread water. Although she could not see their faces because the firelight was behind them, she saw their faint, white, leering smiles and the glint of her own weapons, which were far too far behind them to be of use. Despite their lewd taunts and cheers, she kept her wits. Though her hand weapons lay on the bank, that was not the only way she could defend herself, which, of course, the men did not know. Ignoring their cheers, she slowly moved forward until her feet touched the lake bottom. She needed her hands free to do what she had planned, and she could not do that while treading water. The largest and loudest of the group stepped to the edge of the water. "Come out, wench. We have some business with ye, and if you be nice and we be in the mood, maybe we can have some fun with ye before you die." Maris smiled. The lout and his comrades were so drunk they would probably be lucky to draw a dagger without cutting themselves, much less anything else they had in mind. "Why not come out here, then? From the smell, you and your dogs could use a bath." The men shouted and cursed. "We can wait," one called. "You have to come out sometime, wench." The rest made vile promises of what would happen once they got her hands on her. The one who stepped forward from his companions waved in quiet. "Nay, methinks she's just shy. Methinks we've scared her. What say I come in and fetch you from the water? Will that ease your mind?" To the supportive jeers of his comrades, he began removing his clothes. Maris smiled. She knew that if she taunted them enough, at least one would be stupid and drunk enough to come in after her. The elf prepared a firehawk spell in her mind, as the man nearly fell down removing his breeches. Her smile broadened as she imagined the look of the soon-to-be nude man running frantically through the swamp chased by a flaming apparition. Raising her hands above the water to cast her spell, she stopped when her keen hearing detected faintest whisper on the air. It was an arrow in flight, drawing near, but it came from behind her. She had underestimated the men, and she would pay for it. Closing her eyes and holding her breath, she expected to feel the pain of a steel tip strike home, but none did. Instead, it passed close overhead, moving toward the men. Opening her eyes, she smiled as she watched a big man, naked from the waist down, make a frail attempt to touch the feathered shaft sticking from his forehead before he crumpled to the ground. Chaos and anger reigned over the remaining 9 men. Some searched for their unseen attacker, while those who were wise enough sought cover. Maris' attention remained on the men. If the archer wanted to harm her, he would have done so already. Her ears detected the almost silent whistling of more arrows in flight through the moonlit night. Each shaft unerringly found a home in the body of one of the men. No matter where they hid, an arrow found them. The archer's accuracy impressed Maris, especially with only a quarter moon and her campfire to provide light. She quickly decided, as the body count rose, that whoever the archer was, he was very, very good. When the last of the men lay still, silence prevailed throughout the marsh. It seemed as if death itself caused the stillness that settled over the small battleground. In that extreme quiet, Maris tried to decide her best course of action. Should she stay in the water or try to get ashore to grab a weapon, in case her savior decided she owed him certain favors in return for his aid? She turned slowly in the water, straining her eyes to find the mysterious archer, but she saw nothing in the deep darkness of the surrounding swamp. The thought of being safe, if she remained in the water, passed quickly. With some of the shots the archer made, she knew it was ridiculous to think that the water provided any amount of safety if he chose her as his next target. Despite such thoughts, she did not wish to seem ungrateful for his aid, not that she needed it. Remaining cautious and still in the water, she called, "Thank you!" Her words echoed into the stillness of the night. Nothing moved, no sound other than her fading voice, then silence. Then a deep male voice echoed back over the still water, originating somewhere in the dark swamp beyond the lake's edge. "No thanks are needed, fair princess of the wood. Until we meet again, fare thee well." Keen elfin ears detected the direction of the voice, and she strained her eyes to catch even a dim image. There was the faintest glimmer of moonlight from a mounted figure, but in the blink of an eye he was gone. Maris sighed and swam to the bank. She had hoped to see what the archer looked like. Walking ashore, she looked at the bodies of the men sprawled around her camp. 3 were still alive, though they would be dead soon enough, if she had not finished them with her sword. She sighed again. She had to move her camp to another location before bedding down, since she was not going to bother trying to bury such scum. Besides, she thought, the swamp animals had to eat too. After she gathered her clothes and the rest of her weapons, she searched for anything useful from the bodies before she mounted her horse. She spent a moment to kick the man who had been prepared to come get her, wishing he were still alive enough to feel where she had kicked him.